Right. Great. So first of all, you already heard it, but one preliminary remark, we'll be recording the session. So everyone who does not want to appear in this recording, kindly turn off your video. And now, first of all, a very warm welcome to all participants and our speakers joining us today from different parts of the globe. My name is Andrea Fleschenberg, and I am with Sonja Busu, Hans Asenbaum, Anastasia Delegiau, and Dayo Esoneo, a co-convener of the UK Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group that is actually just one of the organizers of this collaborative webinar and seminar series. With us today and leading in the organization have been Azucena Moram, also on behalf of the ECPR Democratic Innovation Standing Group with Melissa Ross, and we received great support for organizing the webinars and the follow-up workshop at Manchester Metropolitan University, not just from Manchester Metropolitan University, but also from the Centre of Deliberative Democracy at the University of Canberra, the Journal of Democratic Theory, the Journal of Deliberative Democracy, the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster, and many, many colleagues across the globe who agreed to join us and feed into these debates and discussions. So 2 sentences in the beginning about the aims and the perspectives of this series. We collaboratively started the series against the backdrop of the consideration that participatory and deliberative democrats seek to reimagine democracy by deepening and amplifying the voices of ordinary people in governance processes. And with this understanding of democracy is built on a deeply rooted conviction about the equality of all citizens in promoting emancipation. However, like many institutions and practices in Western liberal democracies, participatory and deliberative democrats still have to confront the history of slavery, colonialism, and white supremacy in which contemporary democratic states are built. So we need to remind ourselves, and this was the point of departure, democracy in itself, along with the ideals of freedom and equality, have in many cases been weaponized for war, invasion, and the perpetuation of white domination. And against this backdrop, our series that consists of 2 webinars and 1 follow-up workshop in Manchester will address a range of overarching issues. To what extent do participatory and deliberative democrats and our theoretical methodological perspectives perpetuate these colonial dynamics that I just pointed to? Is it possible to decolonize participatory and deliberative democracy as a field of academic study, but also as a set of practices? How can we reimagine democracy through the lens of indigenous and non-Western centric lenses? And how can participatory and deliberative democrats improve their sensitivity to colonial injustices? And last but not least, one aim is to improve the representation of non-white researchers in the study of participatory and deliberative democracy. In this first webinar, Decolonizing Methods and Research Practice, we will focus on the question how epistemic, methodological, and practical contributions from post-colonial and decolonial thought can actually inform the study and implementation of participatory and deliberative democracy. And our presenters will also address this question, or the question what precisely this can mean in teaching university students across the globe, and that is for raising and educating and also empowering a new generation of researchers. So this webinar series was intended to be a conversation with Dr. Andrea Fleschenberg dos Ramos Pneu, who studied political science, psychology, and European and international law at Rheinische Friedrich-Wilhelms-Universität Bonn and received her doctorate at the University of Erfurt. Since 2018, she is a lecturer at the Institute for Asian and African Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin, and she has also taught at a Pakistani and a Spanish university. And on top of that, she's a consultant for numerous foundations and NGOs, for example, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Cambodia, and Indonesia. Her research examines the question of institution building and citizenship from a critical qualitative social research perspective. And she will be addressing those questions against the backdrop also of her international teaching experience, I believe. Dr. Michael Lyakurwa, who's a head of department at the Department for Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, was aiming to discuss his perspectives about decolonizing the curriculum at African universities from the Tanzanian perspective. And his research focuses on environmental ethics, African philosophy, and formal logic. And in his role of the head of the department there in Dar es Salaam, where I also got to meet him for the first time, he's very much devoted to decolonizing the university curriculum in Dar es Salaam, but also in considering perspectives for doing that in Africa and across the globe. Unfortunately, Michael cannot join us in person today due to severe connectivity issues in Tanzania right now, but he shared his considerations with us ahead of the discussion, and we will feed into the Q&A based on his input as well. And we're also happy to distribute the paper he prepared to all who are interested. Please just get in touch with us if you want to read his input. So after the input presentations, we will have lots of room for discussion, and we'll collaboratively kick off the discussion on the basis of our great speakers. And first of all, and without further ado, Andrea, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And as you heard, I taught at in a number of countries, mostly public sector universities. And I think this is where I also draw from, apart from my research experiences across Asia, but also in Southern Europe. I will also pick up from some of my years working in different locations, which are related to what Danica introduced as concerns for decolonizing academia. And for me, this is a very complex and multidimensional, how does one call it? It's not actually work. It's an encounter, it's a process, it's also a dialogue, which spans the dimensions of teaching, research, also knowledge dissemination and publication. For me, this take, or the take that I take when we look at decolonizing academia, is based on key principles of decentering, decolonial feminist notions of care and research ethics, critical reflexivity, or as coined by Leon Mosavi in a recent article from 2022, decolonial reflexivity, I come back to in a while, collaboration, co-production of, as well as within knowledge projects, as well as dialogue as a key principle. So I'm trying to speak to you today from a concrete working position as a teacher, as a researcher, and as somebody who has co-founded 2 initiatives here at the Humboldt-Universität at the Institute for Asian African Studies, namely negotiating research ethics as decolonial praxis in volatile contexts, as well as researching Asia in pandemic times. These initiatives have been organized together with my dear colleagues Rosa Castillo and Sarah Halls, where we offer regular teaching courses at BA and MA level, training workshops with mentoring spaces, lectures, but also from the very moment onwards, we make sure that all those participating in these initiatives also partake in open access publication outputs. So this might be podcast series, resources that are made openly available, or also special journal issues that involve early career researchers, and in particular also Global South researchers as key authors, and which are published through open access means. I'm also speaking as a mentor from a student autonomous working group on decolonial knowledge production, which came out of a project seminar by a student, Nadine Heil, who is now moderating and establishing this really autonomous space where just the students meet. And I think it's just very important thinking about what does decolonial knowledge production means in its 3rd year. So it's a very long-term project, and some people have been joining it from the beginning. I'm also speaking from 2 other positions, which I think are important because they mark my experiences and also where I look at when I think about decolonial praxis. I'm a co-editorial manager of the International Quarterly for Asian Studies, which is an open access journal. It's working on mostly on Asian studies, but we also try now for quite some time to enact a decolonial praxis of academic publishing. And this is quite something that is easier said than done. It concerns democratization of knowledges. It concerns care when managing who can publish what kind of knowledge through what kind of knowledge production. It concerns translation. It concerns peer review processes, how we engage with gaze, and concrete praxis of research methodological approaches, but also research ethical approaches. And last but not least, we have since 2021 running a Berlin University Alliance-wide project, which is called Colibri, which assembles an interdisciplinary transregional oriented group of researchers and scholar activists. So we are enlarging the scope also of those who we think are important knowledge producers, and pushing the boundaries of what is academic knowledge and where we situate that. And the group which comes together have already pursued for many years a decentered and collaborative knowledge approach. Our partners have long-term relationships with each other. So what are we trying to do with Colibri? We seek to contribute the project of decentering and decolonizing social sciences and humanities, and diversifying what we would call our starting points of knowledge productions. So this means we aim to address concerns about epistemological and political asymmetries when we ask, what would a knowledge production look like that is actually decentered and context sensitive for scholars from various global souths as well as across the global north-south divide? We ask as well, in which ways do theoretical approaches, methodologies, and research ethical standards have to be actually revised when key concepts and approaches from the South sides of enunciation are the key reference points. This is what is meant with decentering. And how do we then, for instance, think human life worlds, societies, as well as the relations between human and more than human, non-human living beings differently? And how does this enrich our conversations, scholarly or not, and knowledge is anywhere? To answer these questions, how do we do this? We rely on frank and open exchanges among all networking partners. And many of us have been in active and very vivid and sometimes also diverging dialogues for many years, if not decades. And what we have added, and this makes this project and this work also challenging, is that in view of recent political developments around the world, such as funding cuts for critical scholarship, a rise in populisms and authoritarianisms, growing mistrust in science and governments across the globe, academic freedom has recently been contracting under threat in many places, and this makes critical debates and critical approaches, and I would tap decolonial approaches and practices under that, even more complicated. So we take in this project also academic freedom itself as a lens to interrogate North-South epistemic and political relations. And we do this through conceptual collaboration and through dialogue. Yeah, and this is a very long-term conversation, I would say. Today, in the remaining time that I have, I would like to present you some sound bites from a forthcoming open access edited volume chapter that is co-written by Muhammad Salman Khan, based at King's College, and Sarah Halls, with regard to our concrete experiences of teaching, researching, and mentoring early career researchers working in, on, and with Asia in pandemic times, having to navigate COVID governmentalities. And I think this also speaks to what Danica introduced, rethinking or democratizing democracy. I think pandemic governmentalities are have been a magnifying glass of sorts as well to revisit a lot of the questions that you just pinpointed. So the working title is Researching South Asia in Pandemic Times as Decolonial Praxis. And in this exploratory paper, we draw from an interdisciplinary transregional research-based learning initiative that I mentioned before, which brought together early career researchers operating from very divergent positionalities towards their intellectual engagement with South Asia in pandemic times. In this paper, we discuss key challenges, themes, and experiences that were shared, as well as practices developed that we needed to develop. I think a lot of us also due to the pandemic, and you might think of the pandemic as you might think of it, but I think the pandemic was a magnifying glass for the decolonial debate, for decolonial practices of ethics, for example, but also of rethinking of research methods, I would argue. How sustainable this is in 5 to 10 years down the road, I think this is something that needs to be seen. But we took this this pandemic as a point of departure, and also as an opportunity to come together to negotiate through this platform what we call an interdisciplinary decentered critical approach of how we can produce knowledges in pandemic times, cognizant that there are divergent local geographies and that we have also very different epistemological, methodological, as well as research ethical interests on positions that we need to navigate. So what we asked then in a very bottom-up process, participatory process, is first that we try to document, so what in each of our cases was the pandemic-specific manifestation and ramifications for the knowledges we tried to produce, the research relationships we saw ourselves in, and what were options and opportunities and challenges, and maybe also limitations to navigate and negotiate them. And on very simple notes, this meant also to re-identify or reread the implications, for example, about risk, crisis, exposure, and vulnerabilities. And furthermore, we were from the beginning also in a decentering approach, not looking into the pandemic as a global health emergency as such, but from the beginning, we had a very vivid debate that there will be pandemic-related legacies and opportunities in terms of longue durée. And that this is maybe what we need to look in, as well as what many talk about, this crisis within crisis, the other dimensions, the socioeconomic, political dimensions of the pandemic. And this was something that a lot of us worried us far much more, a lot of times, than the global health emergency. And we also looked into what does the digital turn maybe mean in terms of negotiating the field, rereading the available canon and rethinking research methods and ethics. Is there a decolonial moment, maybe also because of the digital turn, that we might tap into or that we should be concerned of? So subsequently, we included thoughts on opportunities and cleavages in terms of this initiative, but also in terms of writing and what it means to, navigate the field or the fields that have shifted due to the pandemic. And allow me now some introductory thoughts of how we started off, why it's important to maybe use the pandemic as an important insight and shared experience, although from very divergent positionalities, to rethink decolonial research praxis in terms of methods and ethics of care. I quote now here Sriya Chatterjee from 2020, who wrote, "Seeing or the inability to see something is political. In a world which has tried to make all things visible, the natural history of viruses has been a history of visualization fueled primarily by fear." Chatterjee zooms into the current pandemic times where the coronavirus's visibility has, and I quote here, been both panacea and political tool, depending on who does it. And the processes of visualization, Chatterjee argues, are implicated in forms of care as much as they are in political violence, surveillance, xenophobia, and institutional racism. End of quote. So one key of research is obviously to produce knowledge and claims about what is unknown, unheard, invisible, and about what needs to be considered, reconsidered, and a particular kind of understanding, problematizing, modeling, and presenting some kind of temporary certainty of insight, or what we a lot of times call expertise. So research knowledge is not only about seeing, but also about scale, about cognitive radars or compasses. So what do you see or think that you see when you produce knowledge, when you engage in research practices in pandemic times was something that really bothered us? Where do you look? How and why, with whom? Or shall we say for whom? What does it mean for future scholarly quests in terms of epistemological, methodological, and ethical practices? What are snapshots that we make of these pandemic times? How do they inform where you are heading next as a scholar? Where do you maybe not dare to look, and why? What have you stepped away from? What have you stepped into without hesitating for the blink of an eye? And what does this mean and entail in terms of concrete decolonial praxis? And this is what we asked ourselves as part of this study group. And in a first brainstorming, I think what we came up with, and this is what we write about, is that We witnessed this critical geopolitical events unfolding from some very different, sometimes joint vantage points, given our own social spatial positioning. We watched numerous grave regional and global ramifications unfold that impacted our identities, academic biographies, and everyday realities. We had at the same time little or distant reference points to fathom in which ways this pandemic world would affect our lives, because we had simply never been maybe in such a situation before, or maybe this was not the biggest crisis at our hands. While it was clear that some people would be more affected than others, how these effects would play out was difficult to predict. In universities and research institutions, there was a rush to take teaching, events, and research online. No longer able to meet, there was little space and time to discuss the smaller and larger issues in our social and professional lives that we were confronted with due to the pandemic. While our worries, we argue, were diverse due to our unique positionalities, a number of concerns were actually quite similar, especially for scholars working in and in countries of the Global South or working on topics connected to the Global South, or those marked by different volatilities. Disruptions ranged from travel restrictions to technological disconnects, to delays in research activities, to questions of established ethical protocols. But for many of us, this was not a first. It was a first for a lot of researchers, but for many of us, it was actually not a first. It was what we had to work on and with for many, many years already. So we discussed which kind of so-called contingency plans we developed and what this meant for research designs and research tools. And for instance, for example, we shared stories of frequent electricity or internet cuts, protests, attacks, or social political violence, which disrupted our fieldwork before, putting those involved at risk or placing a too strenuous burden on research participants and research team members. But this was something slightly different and new, and a lot of early career researchers who were part of our mentoring initiative, they didn't feel that they were given, that they had the skills to navigate the new added situation or the compounded situation, nor that they were receiving the mentoring that they needed, because everybody else was so challenged by the pandemic that they somehow fell through the cracks, or responses to their specific needs were delayed. And a lot of times also long-term implications for research projects were not really thought through by Global North's counterparts. And that this added for many of our early career researchers who were part of this initiative, additional layers of uncertainty, anxiety, vulnerabilities, but also inequalities, particularly when we think about that they might be in not very stable visa or residency permit situation or funding situation. So we openly discussed, when we are not sure what is happening, what is the scope of the phenomenon unfolding, and what are its mid to long-term ramifications, how can we plan for the unplannable? And that was sometimes a very painful experience. And this is something that we all had to live with, maybe, that we worked mostly on Pakistan and India, I have to mention here in Afghanistan, but the literature that was produced early on in the pandemic, or that was reread in terms of the canon, was not really very helpful, because underlying it, it had something taken for granted as given, stable, known, or mapped out, a radar of sorts that was, again, very distorted and challenged in terms of what it allows us to see, the visibilities or the cues that we could use for orientation. So this informal working group was for us a kind of a mentoring space, and a peer mentoring space, a protected space that we found very important to engage in a mapping, in a dialogue, and in also a joint reading and rereading of key sources. And actually it led us to producing our own sources as well, because we felt a lot of the literature that came out in rethinking methods and ethics was not really helpful. Yeah, so we explored and discussed the implications for those who are situated in communities in South Asia, either as researchers or living there or having to travel there. We exchanged and collected experiences about useful resources that we could use for making sense and for planning, but there it was really challenged. And you might disagree with me because you might say, oh, but there were so many publications there. But when you read this with the members of the study group, you actually see that a lot of it was centered on a particular experience, on a particular positionality that didn't help the majority members in our room. So this platform was a kind of a platform for co-learning through the different steps of a knowledge production, through peer-to-peer exchange and dialogue. And we hope that, especially, I think maybe you all remember, and I think for some it might seem now really far away, although it's not really that far away, and let's see what the winter brings. We also thought we have to have like a kind of a sense of community, because anxiety is also not a very good advisor when it comes for thinking through complex research processes. Yeah, and I think something that was very contested in what we talked about and what it means in concrete terms of this open-ended discussion was, what do we actually understand by the term crisis? What is here at crisis? How does this intersect with academic knowledge productions? Do we have the right methods to understand, to make something visible? And some people said, I just feel maybe also I should stop the research I'm doing because of, in light of the pandemic, maybe I should look somewhere completely else. Maybe we are asking all the wrong questions and we're using maybe the wrong methods, because maybe we need other kinds of knowledges and we need to rethink the research we do in more fundamental terms. And I think these open-ended discussions based on very everyday experience of doing research in Global South was for us also an example of employing a decolonial praxis. And it helped us somehow to build shared frames of reference that allowed each member of the working group to better understand also the struggles of our colleagues, going through which they can help to build more context-sensitive collaborations. But I think we're still meeting regularly, but for producing then, I think one of the challenges, I think, of co-producing knowledges, which is something identified by many as one key take of a decolonial research praxis, yeah, this co-production of knowledges, was severely also challenged because of the pandemic overload and anxieties. And what we have tried then to do is to find also collaborative formats of publishing, co-writing. So a lot of the colleagues wrote together, co-authored articles. I think this helped, for example, to share things. We've got a number of positive responses on what was published. And also what was a challenge is actually very interesting. A lot of people said, are you actually writing now about failure, about missed opportunities when you rethink? So what is this about? So we even tried, we invited, I would say now, Global South scholars, very established at Global North universities, and some turned us down for a lecture series we then organized in the last semester, and saying, oh, this makes me very vulnerable in academia, in public debates about research, and I would also never write about it because I would be writing about failure. And I think this is what we tried to do very, very differently, that we tried to not understand this as failure, but we said this rethinking that the pandemic opened as an opportunity, this momentum that we tried to grasp, means probably a very open conversation and rethinking. And maybe I'll leave it at that. I found it interesting that the early career researchers, they were all up for co-authored writing, but the big hats, they were more difficult to convince to co-write or co-contribute to a lecture series, to us to share their experiences, where probably would also be challenged from the position they are doing research, which has been revisited and also in decolonial terms due to the pandemic. We found this a more difficult conversation to have, because probably it also meant, or it means, I mean, I leave this open now, and I think I'm now over with my time. It probably means also to rewrite or write new research method books, research ethical compendiums. And the question is who should write them and who should rethink them. And I'll leave it as this provocative note that we had a lot of challenges to get senior researchers to talk about how they navigate this. It's always easier to get people to talk about decolonial debates, theories, describing the problem, but when we think about research practice and learning and really being open, and I'm not an early career researcher anymore. Yeah, we were just facilitators, Sarah, Salman, and me. It was very difficult to get good materials and to get good voices that could be like, let's say, like a sparring partner as well. Yeah, to take cue to develop ideas from. And I leave it at that point for the moment.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for these invigorating insights and also the outline of your practice so far. And yeah, I think that it's resonating with what a lot of us experience from different parts of the world, different perspectives and our respective, positionalities during the pandemic as well. When I got in touch with Michael for the first time, this was actually during the pandemic, and I got something like academic and teaching refugee status at the University of Dar es Salaam and the University of Nairobi. And we started talking about perspectives on decolonizing the curriculum. So it was a very lively debate covering many aspects and facets. And I'm very glad that Michael managed to get over his notes to us, and Melissa and Azucena now will provide us with some input from Michael's side, who, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, due to connectivity issues, cannot be with us in person right now.
That is correct. Thank you so much, Danica. As Danica was mentioning before, and when we opened this session, we also mentioned this, Michael has very severe connectivity issues and cannot be here with us online, but he has sent the input he had prepared for the conversation. And so now I'm going to read what the input that he prepared. Of course, I cannot replace his position nor be his voice, but we can at least have his thoughts with us today, and hopefully that will lead to a more lively discussion. So Michael starts with an affirmation that African universities need to decolonize their curricula, and the sooner the better. Both the content and the teaching methods need to be evaluated. Decolonization means that Africans have both control over the process of formulating curricula and the knowledge produced through them. However, decolonization should not mean teaching only about Africa or isolating the continent from the rest of the world, but teaching what is useful to African societies under their natural environments. A key facet of decolonization must also entail the development of Africa-situated perspectives on global problems, such as inequality, terrorism, and climate change. Africa must position itself as owner, producer, and user of local knowledge that has also regional and global resonance. So decolonization is not only necessary to overcome existing exploitative political and economic orders, but also to, quote, provide original responses to universal issues such as health, education, democratic participation, and social organization, end of quote. Legansh further postulates that, open quote, first-generation colonialism was the conquering of the physical spaces and bodies of the colonized, and second-generation colonialism was the colonization of the mind through disciplines such as education, science, economics, and law, end of quote. Decolonization will thus entail a response to both first and second-generation colonialism. According to the Council on Higher Education in 2018, the decolonization of the curriculum should entail the resurfacing of subjugated knowledges and reorienting knowledge production in order to do away with education that presumes that, open quote, everything that is advanced, good, and civilized is defined and measured in European terms, end of quote, by Kelly 2000. In his context, Michael writes, decolonization is understood as a process whereby African people demand changes to their curricula and the possibility to formulate and implement their own ideas, development agendas, strategies, and plans as free citizens in their own countries. So why decolonize the curriculum? Michael shares with us some experiences from Tanzania in his input. He begins with a quote by Akil Membe that warns us that, open quote, we cannot keep teaching the way we have always taught, end of quote. His main argument is that the current curriculum on development and teaching and the learning systems among higher education institutions discourage students and teachers from a free pursuit of knowledge, and that there need to be changes, the sooner the better. First of all, Knowledge systems within the curricula are not contextualized to the present African environment. Tensions exist between the ambition of decoloniality and the notion that there should be a centralized and rather standardized form of knowledge. Second, the current curriculum setting and knowledge systems position Africa as a net importer rather than a net exporter of global knowledge. SAR in 2016 has proposed that the aim of decolonizing the curricula should therefore be to regain, open quote, intellectual sovereignty, end of quote, in order to develop our own metaphors for the future so as to eliminate the long-time effects of alienation and enslavement. African universities need to reposition themselves as producers and exporters of global knowledge. The resources are already there, they just need to be recognized and harnessed. Third, decolonization means that Africans can have both control over the process of formulating curricula and the knowledge produced through them. As it currently stands, both the process of formulating the curriculum and producing knowledge originate from the West. For example, in Tanzania, the procedure outlined by the Tanzanian Commission for Universities for developing new curricula requires that universities benchmark and compare these to the international and national priorities. However, the Commission for Universities in Tanzania does not provide guidelines on how such benchmarking ought to be done, and many curriculum developers simply copy those already established in Western universities. Lacking in this process is a clear distinction between knowledge that should be universalized and globalized, and that should be localized and contextualized, for instance, with respect to Tanzania's specific development challenges. A fourth point that Michael makes is that the curriculum content is not the only thing to blame. Teaching methods are of serious concerns as well. Curricula in some universities specify that lecturers should use examples from Tanzania and the rest of Africa as much as possible. However, the practice is different, and lecturers do not consider the curriculum. Instead, they opt to apply examples coming from outside of Africa, and especially from Europe and North America. Most of the lecturers are young and inexperienced and do not have the requisite experience to do the task. Are the academics prepared for the envisioned change? Do they have the required expertise? Perhaps we need to decolonize the mindset of academics first before we decolonize the curriculum. A fifth point is that of language of instruction. And this is a hard bone to crack in Tanzania, Michael affirms. There has been debate around this area for a long time in Tanzania, whether Swahili should be used as a medium of instruction in universities or English should be retained. The intentional disassociation of the language of conceptualization, thinking, formal education, and mental development from the language of daily interaction in the home and community was a key element of colonialism. So language is key in decolonizing the curriculum. In Tanzania, most students have a very poor mastery of the English language. Yet this is the very same language that is used as a medium of instruction at the universities and even at secondary education. There is no consensus yet of whether to change to Kiswahili as the medium of instruction or retain English. To conclude, the decolonization of the curriculum requires more than just changing the curriculum. How things are taught and academics' attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs in this process are pivotal to the decolonization process. Decolonization is more than just a choice of materials. The attitude and disposition to materials used in the curriculum is critical. Many academics still assume that Western knowledge systems, quote, constitute the only basis for higher forms of thinking, unquote. This form of knowledge and authority is passed on to African students as an unquestionable truth and of inscrutable value. The education triad comprises the teacher, the learner, and the content that is the curriculum, which unfolds within historical, political, social, and educational contexts. In Tanzania, much emphasis has been put on changing the curriculum. However, changing one aspect of the triad without due consideration to the others will not effect the desired change. Changing the curriculum alone will not work. We must decolonize the mind of the academic as well. One final problem that Michael highlights in relation to the context in Tanzania is that most graduates cannot get jobs, and some attributes to this kind of education they receive at the university. Universities still have traditional curricula that is not responsive to the current needs of society. The curricula does not prepare students to employ themselves. They have remained in a kind of curriculum that prepares students for white-collar jobs, like it was during the colonial times. The first president of Tanzania recognized this problem long ago, just after the independence in 1961. But efforts to change the situation have not borne the expected results. Decolonizing the curriculum is therefore proving difficult in Tanzania and the African context, and he invites us to discuss why this is the case. So this was the input for Michael. I will now give back the word to Danica, and we will open the floor for questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mel, for summarizing the input from Michael, and thanks on long distance, asante sana to Michael, to not keep up the monopoly of English language all the way through, although we're going to stick to this for the rest of the discussion, I believe. So we have many interesting aspects of decolonizing research practice, decolonizing teaching, the curriculum, and also the mindset and the question of what has happened first, decolonizing the mindset, the practice, or maybe it's an interplay of both things. Andrea, first of all, I would like to ask you if you want to respond to Michael's input. Unfortunately, we cannot have this kind of a back and forth conversation on Michael's behalf. And then we would open the floor to all. Raise your hands, drop something in the chat. We're looking forward to debates. Andrea.
No, I think it resonates a lot with what we also discuss as part of our networking initiatives with colleagues and what we also experience. So I think we should open the debate. Yeah, that would be good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so far, anyone raising his hand? Azucena.
Hi, yeah, I was thinking about something that Michael wrote about also like decolonizing the mind of scholars doing this work, and I think that it would be very interesting to do a reflection on how would that materialize in collaborations with Global South universities, given the fact that the also like the economic hierarchies of these universities and the distribution of actual economic power among these universities is so just unbelievably I'm sorry, my English is not great today, disparate basically. So I think that it would be interesting to note ways forward and also like possible challenges as to like how to address these economic disparities between also universities.
Thank you so much. Subfit. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this, but Society of Professors. Sorry, I cannot see the whole name. Somebody's raising his hand, and I'd like to invite you. Okay. More hands. Melissa is raising her hands, and Andrea also wants to drop in. So Melissa, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I wanted to suggest that we maybe collect 2 or 3 questions, and then Andrea can react to all of them, if that's all right, Andrea. And all right, I think now Sofit Society of Professors has unmuted themselves. So if you want to jump in. Yes.
That's actually, that's actually Reginald Duer, who I ended up using the wrong account on my Zoom once I appeared as Selena anyway, because of these technical challenges. But today I've appeared as our society. And I'm sorry, I'm talking to you from Kenya. Danica knows that. The rest of you might not. Sorry for using the wrong account. I just really was fascinated by the presentation by our two presenters. I just wanted to raise 2 or 3 remarks very fast. The first one is, has any of our presenters considered also how the world is divided up by a hegemonic epistemological system? I mean, when, for example, we talk about African thought, what is Africa in the first place? Did Africa become Africa by the people in that continent defining themselves? Or should that also not be decolonized? The second point, I was very interested in what Andrea was discussing about responses to COVID. And just off the record, I will want to really follow up on the work you do, Andrea, because I am doing similar work. And I'm wondering, have you been exploring, for example, the way in which agency has been taken from masses of people all over the world through the assumption that anything effective against COVID must come from Geneva and from CDC and from FDA? Thank you very much.
All right, I think we have 2 comments now. Andrea, do you want to respond? And we just see who raises her hand next.
One more maybe, and then I can try to respond.
So.
Then maybe I'll jump in because Ines posted a question on the chat. And first she asked for apologies because she's coming in and out because of childcare duties. But she says she has a simple or not question. Can decolonization of research and education happen successfully, separately? It feels like this is often how institutional level approaches, at least in the UK, frame it. Curriculum first, often a student-led demand, research processes and methods second. How do we support both things together to happen?
Yeah.
All right.
I'll try to jump in here, Danica, if I may. No, I don't think this, to start with the last question from Ines, no, it's not separate, because how can we, I mean, it's interlinked. I mean, what's the purpose of decolonizing research when this doesn't translate into democratizing and decentering? I mean, the question is, what is decolonial? I think this is also a very big debate, but I introduced some moving parts of key parameters in the beginning, that how I read it and how we're trying to live and enact it in concrete practice. So I think, you know, you cannot do one without the other, because and this is linked also to the last question, and I forgot to note down the name of the person who just spoke from Kenya under this Software Society of Professors. So I cannot unfortunately address you by name. If you could write it in the chat, then I will do that. So I think this is the purpose of decolonizing a curriculum, if we don't have in mind wider hegemonic ramifications that are part and parcel of why universities are colonial or neo-colonial spaces, or why I'm talking here from Berlin, and I recently joined. And the funny note is, I mean, I'm an East German with a distinct political biography. I think you can understand what I'm trying to hint at. So for me, being now hired at HU was something unthinkable before the wall came down, and my family high-fived us. But so this is legacies that institutions hold. While Humboldt, for example, I think only just started, or the Berlin University Alliance, as the universities only just started to think about what does decolonizing the university actually mean, and why we are doing this is not just something that happens in one field, but fields are actually entangled. Yeah, I think here at Humboldt University, sometimes I think it feels like this is not yet a mainstream discussion, although there are very, very many initiatives, a lot of them student led. I agree as well. A lot of times also what we call the Mittelbau, so the segment between where I am as associate professor, I'm not a full-term professor, yeah, where we have research associates, research fellows, the intermediate level, so to speak, between students and full professors. So we see a lot of initiatives there, and then selected disciplines and selected professors who are joining in on these efforts. So I fully endorse that this needs to be an challenges that we see are also linked to issues of funding. Yeah, so for example, in the Colibri project that we have, or in all those corporations and initiatives that I was part, the two initiatives that I just mentioned and talked to you about, they neither count to our hours that we need to teach. So this is a kind of an effort we do together to pooling our resources. They are unfunded, completely unfunded. They don't count for anything. Quite at the opposite. People might look at us and say, isn't this a political activity here? Yeah, is this part of academics? And maybe this is off the record as well. We know what the problems are when we try to work on an equal footing in German, Augenhöhe auf Augenhöhe, when we can look each other in the eye. It also has to do with funding lines, yeah? And even when we try, in the praxis, we hit an admin and we hit a funding logic here in the Global North that doesn't allow us to do this. So solidarity is a concrete praxis, but it also needs resources. And this makes it sometimes for us really, really, really difficult. And this is something we find also very difficult to negotiate. And the other comments, the other questions and comments I see rather as comments, and a colleague from Kenya, I think this is something in our researching Asia and pandemic times is something that really struck us from the beginning. And I think there has been some excellent writings done as well early on since the pandemic started, what counts as knowledge and what then counts also as a remedy. There was a big debate on this as well. I think a lot of people have written about it, and we read a lot of those texts exactly because we were discussed with our colleagues and early career researchers that were part of the initiative that we needed to engage with this question because it's related to many other questions that we face in terms of what I asked as a question, what knowledge do we actually need? Yeah. And this debate is out there, and we have read those texts. I also include them always in the canon of my own seminars that I've been teaching since the pandemic started on COVID governmentalities and research praxis. But I still feel that more support, more resources are needed. And I also see with a lot of colleagues that are part of our networks, they are overburdened. Because if you are based in the Global South, or even if you're based here in the Global North on a scholarship, there's a lot of demand from you. There's a lot of pushing and pulling taking place without the proper resources and the proper institutional settings to navigate this carefully. And it's a lot of times actually quite a bit frustrating, I would have to say. Also from our side, that if we want to enact different practices, it's not very easy to do because so many moving parts have to be considered.
Thank you so much for these remarks and reflections. We now have two people raising their hands. My apologies in advance if I'm mispronouncing names. Gerhard Hassanin and Dr. Earl Chesterton. So maybe in that order.
Okay, thank you. You pronounced it right. Don't worry. Sorry, I won't be able to. My laptop isn't like on its best performance today, so I can't turn my camera on. I just wanted to come in with a question, and I think lots of people have already, the people who spoke before me already, like touched upon this on like what the meaning of research is, what decolonizing means, and what Africa means. I just wanted to ask Dr. Andrea, because you spoke a lot about how your attempts to decolonize and decenter involved in including different forms of knowledge, quote unquote, and different scholars at different levels on the career ladder, and also from different places. But also, do you have something to say about whether any of these attempts produced anything on the level of the discourses or the theories or the concepts with which we think about participatory democracy, or with which we think about research in the first place? Whether anything substantial has come out of this? Because if just to link this back to what everyone has been talking about, and how do we expand participation while at the same time making sure that when we interact with different knowledges, we don't just assimilate them into the concepts that are already hegemonic, and thus kind of empty them of any subversive or radical potential, for example. Or as I think someone has, I think in Michael's paper, it came up that how do we really make ensure that they really come in with something new that would contribute to universal problems, rather than just being another like surface level multiculturalist inclusion that, okay, it's great, but that doesn't really realize the full potential of decolonizing. Because if we think of how our practices are constructed through discourses and theories that are already hegemonic, how can this participatory impulse that we're trying to decolonize change the theories themselves and the discourses and the concepts that we use to enact these practices in the first place? So if you have anything to share on this front, then it would be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Orcheston.
Can you hear me, Danica? Dr. Andreas and Melissa, thank you very much for an insightful presentation. I'm joining this conference from Pretoria, South Africa, and I was strangely amazed by the input when it comes to the level and the understanding and interpretation between decolonization and research methods in Africa. First and foremost, I must be honest by saying that the input that was given as South African, as the southern part of Africa and part of SADC, I don't know if I can identify with all of those opinions that were shared. It is respectfully accepted in the way that it has been presented. However, I don't know if I fully can stand in and agree with some of the perceptions regarding how to decolonize, colonialize research methods and research design in particular. I recently presented a paper at one of our at University South Africa on engaged scholarship, and that is the route that in South Africa that we are moving towards. The idea of moving, especially when it comes to post-COVID, to move towards engaged scholarship and engaged scholarship programs, which include community engagement and the like. As South Africans, we are at the forefront of the whole global agenda in making sure that we address all the basic and primary goals of contributing to a globalized community in general. And we are doing wonderful work as South Africans on this front. I first, maybe as my contribution to this in this forum, I want to speak about the sovereignty, and in particular when it comes to post-COVID, that we perhaps, I think the professor from Kenya said that where's the idea of how do we relook at Africa? And my response, there's actually a sentence introductory to my response, is to say that we need to look at Berlin as Berlin, and we need to look at South Africa as South Africa. And if we go really deep into who we are, and I think that is the idea of the study that Andrea is doing, is to go deep down into the self and to find really what are the things that move you. And if we all come together and we share these ideas, rather than addressing Asia as entire Asia, look into the areas within Asia and getting the ideas and the perceptions and the feeling of communities within Asia, really getting people from the ground. So it's a matter of taking this global idea and just for a moment after the pandemic, break it down and to get the individuality within each and every country, within each and every person. That's the first approach in terms of decolonialization, because colonialization is yes, it's experienced at a country level, but it is actually felt on the skin on an individual level. And I can speak that as a South African. And we as South Africans, we had to rethink, we had to remodel, we had to reformulate who you are in order to be able to support the next person. And now you become a community. And now you're thinking, you start influencing each other's thinking in the end. That is why we're still standing strong, but so many other challenges that we're experiencing in South Africa. I just want to alert to one last thing when it comes to, I think Andrea also alluded to the idea of now I'm not alluded to the point of funding, and with all universities and with all research studies that funding is paramount when it comes to when you want to do certain things. And part of the engagement scholarship paper that I wrote is what I observed especially when it comes with decolonization or colonization of thinking, of academics, of research methods. You choose the research method and research design befitting of the kind of funding and the intended outcome of the study. In other words, you are gearing your research model towards what the funder wants, and that is the devil that we must break. That is the back of the evil that we must break when it comes to decolonization, colonializing of research methods and research design. Lastly, my approach and my proposal to this team is what I refer is alternation theory, a thinking of moving towards getting the feedback and readjusting the thinking based on the current experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this, these comments and this voice from South Africa now joining us. I think it's also very important to reconsider talking about Africa and Asia and so on. We now have Melissa who wants to ask a question. I have one brief question just that I took from discussions with Michael, and then if nobody else raises his or her hand, Andrea will get the chance to give her final input or comments, and you're certainly invited so to continue raising your hands. So I will withdraw my question at this point. It more concerns the matter of language in teaching and doing research. Maybe that pops us up anyways. It played a role in Michael's presentation. Hand over to Melissa and then TP, who also, not sure, raised his or her hand.
Thanks, Danica. I have it's a difficult question, so maybe it's more of a reflection, but I think it connects very well to the last contribution. So I was thinking, particularly, Andrea, during your presentation, how you were speaking about these alternative approaches to coping with the challenges of the pandemic, but which were not new in some contexts, right? That had to do with anxiety, with precarity, with severe barriers to even the most basic aspects of everyday life, and doing academic work on top of that, developing collaborative writing, co-production of context-sensitive knowledge on the one hand, which are, I think, essential to many decolonial and post-colonial projects within academia, but also this kind of bringing out the human, right? Being able to speak about failure, about vulnerabilities, or being able to produce knowledge that maybe doesn't check all the boxes for points that count towards tenure, but it's important to put out there on the one hand. But then on the other hand, we have the very serious challenges that, and maybe even the false motivation that comes from the way the academic system is structured, and that we as researchers still need to comply to, and we are still working with this environment, right? So how do we bring those together? Because on the one hand, we can do collaborative writing and producing alternative forms of knowledge, but we still have to fill our duties within the academic system. So teaching duties, research duties, massive publications to even have a chance of doing this profession, especially for junior researchers and for migrant researchers. So this, in the end, this leads to even more overworking, or to just finding alternative career paths from academia. I mean, I don't want to be super negative at this stage, but I do think this is a tension between, or there's a very present tension between really opting for a decolonial approach to knowledge production while still depending for our livelihoods on the academic system as it's structured today, particularly in the West. So if you have any solution to this dilemma, I would be more than happy to hear about it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have two more comments or questions. And although I hate to do this, I would kindly ask you to keep the comments short at this point, because we're already over time. So maybe 2 minutes top each. Jump in, TP, and then Reginald again. I'm not sure who's appearing. Yeah.
Hello. Can I?
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for an interesting discussion. I was just wondering. Sorry. Let me introduce myself. I'm Tejendra. I work in India, working with the tribal communities. So, in terms of describing the decolonizing process for a researcher, account can be his own finding without any referencing. Actually, could be a legitimate way of accepting or describing decolonization way of doing research.
All right, this was a pointed and brief question. And Reginald, again, the final question is yours.
Oh, there we are. Okay. Thank you very much. And I will be very fast. I just wanted to follow up what I was trying to raise. And when one tries to make it very brief, one sometimes doesn't make it very clear. We, for example, talk about the North and the South. And at the same time, for example, Europe is considered to be a continent separate from Asia, although every geologist will tell us it's really one continent. And so the struggle we are having is a struggle one of the colleagues has just mentioned. We are trying to prepare people for degrees in universities in a situation that is being described for us by the colonial powers. And then we are saying we are taking these very same institutional structures and decolonizing them. Can we really go as far as we need to actually get the job done? Because it might even have to include operating beyond the institutions set up by the colonizers and their inheritors, their heirs, universities, degrees, accreditation. As long as we are still operating under that kind of rubric, how far can we go with decolonization? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think this is and was and will be a very important question, and how far the institutional structure that we're all are teaching in one way or the other and doing research in allows us to decolonize or practice in teaching. Andrea, so the final statement and comment will be yours. You're free to cherry pick from all questions, comments, and contributions raised. Thank you so much.
How many seconds do I have?
So I think we're already over
No,
time,
no.
but please cherry pick whatever you want.
Don't worry. No. I think I actually found it very insightful and always enriching to listen, because a lot of were not questions, there were comments and important contributions to very big debate. We could just, always just to spotlight a bit and pick here and there and showcase whatever. Yeah, I would like to respond a little bit to Melissa about these duties, the performativities that we all have to engage with, and the tasks. And I think now it's called, since the pandemic, it's called the triple crunch, no? Especially for those who are in between, the intermediates, who are not yet full professors, but who are between ECR and postdocs. They face this triple crunch. You can think of collaborative research and writing, whatever you think of. This is what I've been doing now for the past 15 years. And I'll stick to it. And I think this is the only way of slowly also, because I think what I also see is it changes also our way of academic writing, which is very problematic, which is also a lot of times very North-centered. What is proper academic writing? What are the writing formats, citation formats, and so on and so forth. I think I've always found it very fruitful. And I think also we have to enlarge a little bit our scope in other disciplines. Out of maybe the faculties of social sciences and humanities, co-writing is very normal. Co-producing knowledge is also very, very normal. And we take turns. For example, now in this chapter, Salman is first and others, I'm first, or Sarah is first. We discuss who needs to score some points. And then we use this strategically, we have our backs as well. And, I don't want to delve now into the intricacies of our teamwork, but I think this is, very honestly, I think this is the way that I've chosen, that I found very helpful, also with my own care responsibilities. And the others I take as comments. And Reginald, I think I fully agree with you. And this is why, for example, here in our team, we work with the transregional perspective, and the new area studies approach that we have is that we actually open and question these containers. But I also admit that even within Humboldt's conversations that we have, we see other from mainstream disciplines who would question this kind of approaches. And we have a lot of translational work to do and stand our ground to sort of have some cracks and fissures in some more hegemonic debates and approaches to the phenomena that we study. I sometimes also think what we say here, we don't have as many students maybe here as other mainstream disciplines have, because a lot of students at HU who join us here, it's more complicated what we teach. It's more complicated to then engage in knowledge productions, especially when you have to engage with decolonial debates. It's creates confusions and anxieties for many here. It's more difficult to navigate, and not everybody stays on board. We also have to see that there are also counter movements, counter currents, and people also choosing certain degrees and thus engage with us also from different agendas and vantage points. And the last comment then maybe with Gerhard, I would like to ask back, what is substantial for you? When does something count as substantial? I think the working group that we have, which Kai Kresse at the Center for Modern Orient established a couple of years ago, where we sit once a month together with colleagues from the Global South and different Global South and Global North, and it is called Theories and Thinkers from the South, where we really change the side of enunciation and of understanding, and really taking this decentering to heart. I think this is very substantial that we have this. It leads to publications. Maybe this is then something considered substantial. But I also think that we have this process, that we engage in this encounters, that we challenge each other, that we are in conversation with each other, I think it leads to different knowledge productions. How quick this enters into whatever kind of theoretical or methodological mainstream, I think that's another question. And I think we also have to be very concerned, and I hope that this, which some describe now as a hype or a buzzword, the decolonial, which then some leads some to question if this is maybe become an empty signifier. I think this is what we are exactly concerned with here, that it's neither a buzzword nor something, a hype that we adjust or take care of, but that we really and this is long time thinking. It's not easily done to really rethink the research methods and the teaching through this. It's a trans-regional network and it's an interdisciplinary network, but I think that we have this. I think it will produce something. It has produced already something, but if this qualifies then as substantial also in big impact things, I don't know. It's probably we don't talk about this because we are very pleased and grateful that we have this initiative and that we have some funding as well. I have to admit that we have now a big number of funding that we can also do this. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for these great contributions, the comments, the questions. I guess there's much to be discussed, and there are many open-ended questions at this point. I hope that this session and also the open questions that probably remain at this point, as well as the follow-up webinar at the 18th of November, where Reginald Odur and Ina Kana will present perspectives on decolonizing democratic theory, will help facilitate and enrich these conversations and exchanges. What's left, I think, is just to thank you, the speakers and all participants again on behalf of the organizers for these lively debates. And hope to see you again. Sonia posted the link and we'll also going to distribute it via social media and so on. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us today.
Right.